Good day, everybody, and welcome to today's session on the value of Linux to the enterprise. I'm Jeff Scheel, Chief Engineer for Linux on Power, or sometimes, as I say, Power Linux, so please excuse me if I interchange both. I've spent the last 15 years largely in this position around Linux on IBM's Power systems. But it's truly my pleasure to spend this time with you today to explain how Linux may have value to IBM I customers. Because you see, I'm from Rochester, Minnesota. I had my start in the AS400 group prior to working on Linux and helping people understand where the industry is headed, what's going on, is a key part of this role as Chief Engineer. You'll notice on the front screen here before we get started a couple tags. I'd like to point those out. First of all, the little DW tag is a pointer to the Linux on Power community in DeveloperWorks. If you're looking for more information after the session today, that's a great place to get started for technical information. The Google Plus badge, the little red badge with G+, is a reference to a Linux on Power community out in Google+. That is the place where I will personally be posting the PDF version of today's slides. We'll also try to get them up as part of the conference for you, but if that doesn't happen, if you're familiar with Google+, feel free to reach out to Google+ and find the slides and use them and ask questions. And if you're more social than I, feel free to follow us on Twitter. Much of the content that we post in either of those two environments and others, we will send out through our Twitter channel to make sure people get notice that information is available. And should you be very old-fashioned, as I am myself, my email address is there. I take questions all the time from customers. In fact, I often joke that I'll answer your questions before I'll answer my colleagues' questions. So feel free to use the old traditional email path as well. So let's go ahead and get started. The goal today is really to cover three things. First of all, I'd like to give you a brief history of Linux. Where did it come from? What's it about? Who are the key names, etc.? Many of you are probably familiar with these points, so we won't spend too much time in this first set of slides. We'll then begin to explore the Linux operating system and all the various distributions, explain how it works, do a little compare-contrast sorts of activities there. And then we'll go into the final section and really start to explain how people are using Linux, why they're using Linux, and start to plant some seeds as to the value of Linux to the enterprise and really answer the question that is the subject of today's discussion. So those are the three things I hope to accomplish today. So what is Linux in a simple sort of explanation? Well, you'll hear people say Linux is not Unix. In fact, that's sort of what Linux means. It's one of those geekish sorts of names that has, names within names and recursion and all of those interesting things that programmers tend to do. It was originally created, the Linux kernel that is, was created by Linus Torvalds in 1991 and really was the answer to a question that others in the open source community like Richard Stallman and others had been trying to answer and provide is how does one actually create a whole operating system? Stallman has been successful at creating compilers and libraries and sort of laying the upper levels of the software architecture, but nobody had yet come forward with a kernel that could run underneath this. And so Linus Torvalds is one of those names that people recognize, respect, revere as really the founder of Linux. But I'm sure Linus, being a very humble person, he would arguably give credit to others in this world as well. But few people do realize it's been around since 1991, which says we're coming up here on 25 years of Linux being in existence. Today we talk about it being robust in functionality and scalability, We talk about its stability and its features. It really has come a long ways, as we'll see later. I think one of the key attributes of Linux, much like Unix started out with, is now this ability to operate on any platform. Unix really was the first operating system to try and address this portability of applications across multiple platforms. Linux has really delivered on that. And some could argue that Linux has really delivered on sort of the true Unix vision, although I'm sure it would be a lively debate with people who were fundamental to the delivery of Unix. How do people get Linux today? Well, most people talk about Linux distributions. They talk about the vendors that provide these distributions. SUSE, Red Hat, key distributions in what we would think of as the traditional enterprise. They're really on-prem, in the data center, servers. The new up-and-comer here is Canonical with their Ubuntu distribution. You probably heard about Ubuntu, a very key desktop-type distribution that is now making inroads into servers, largely through the cloud environment. But behind all of this and what SUSE, Red Hat, and Canonical do with their operating systems is really bundle a group of software out of open source communities. Open source communities are communities where the source code for these packages exists today. Out on the internet, could be GitHub, could be SourceForge, could be somebody's private source code repository, where people can look at the source, they can build the source, they can contribute patches to enhance the source in an organized fashion, of course, through something we call a maintainer who approves the patches that come in. But this ability to see the software, to have the software, to be able to build the software has really fostered a whole new world of open innovation where people are collaborating and where it's cheaper to implement or to extend something that somebody has done than to start from the beginning and implement it yourself. One of the key pieces people always talk about is the Linux kernel. You see a link to kernel.org, which is where the kernel source is actually maintained. And what has also evolved in this world is a set of foundations, non-profit consortiums to sort of promote this. And the most common, well-known one is the Linux Foundation. Again, there's a link to the Linux Foundation where you could go off and learn about how folks like Jim Zemlin and others promote Linux and help people learn more about it. Linux has really evolved over time. It really started out at the edge of the infrastructure, sort of buried deep in the data center. And that's what the line at the top is supposed to show. Is it really started, if you look at this whole sort of hierarchy or this connected set of systems, it really started deep in the enterprise. In fact, one of my former bosses used to tell stories of having meetings with customers in the early to mid-2000s where they're talking about this very topic, what is the value of Linux? And there would oftentimes be a management team, perhaps even a CEO in the room or some other executive, as well as the admins and the folks. And it was not uncommon for those discussions to include the CEO or the executive asserting, we don't have Linux, we're not going to go to Linux. And there'd sort of be a look around the room by my executive who would recognize a couple people kind of smirking and realize as you started to talk to those folks that actually Linux was already in their data center. It started as internal servers for file and print, for internal email, for departmental databases, then sort of evolved into the infrastructure and then really has worked its way into business applications and ultimately into the whole data content, the warehouse, etc., to the point where Linux has permeated today the whole ecosystem. Of course, we also know that it's gone in the opposite direction on the slide to the left into all of our handheld devices, and the whole embedded Linux world is a world where, you know, a lot of people have routers, a lot of people have Wi-Fi in their household. Linux is there in other places, including in their cars and places they may not even fully understand. So Linux really started deep, small, quiet, and has grown out and permeated the whole enterprise, and today is capable of solving all of those problems. If we lay it out in a timeline, here's a slide from a few years ago. If we lay it out in a timeline, that first 10, 12, 13 years, as I said, was really about web infrastructure, edge of the network, departmental servers. From 2005, 2006, we started to have this explosion of web servers and additional application web servers, the whole client-server architecture. Linux was a key part of that environment in the mid-2000s, continuing to filter 2007, 2008 into the business-critical enterprise workload environments, and now very much not only driving the dynamic infrastructure, it's key to the cloud. If we were to continue into 2012 and beyond, it's key to the cloud. It's key to analytics with things like Watson and big data. It is really in the heart of the enterprise. So it has been on this maturation process. But the analogy that I would also suggest with this, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, is the discussions around Linux have also evolved here personally, my personal experience. In the mid-2000s, a lot of people considering Linux on the Power Platform especially would say to me as we were talking to them, so which Linux distribution do you recommend? That time we had Red Hat, SUSE, Turbo Linux, I think, was still with us. They were one of the three that we originally supported. Which Linux would you recommend? And so they were looking at starting with Linux, obviously hadn't considered it, didn't fully understand the value of Linux. Today nobody asks that, or very, very few people ask that. And the question is really about, do you have my Linux? And so folks, to me that's an indication of how enterprises have standardized on it and made it common to what they're doing. And this is going to be a key theme that we're going to come back to Linux and the value to the enterprise, is this theme of commonality. So it's both indicative of the maturation of Linux and also a key part of the value proposition that we're looking at today. So in 2014, as Jeff Shield travels around the country talking to people, the reason for adopting Linux is quite varied. But if I were to pick sort of my top 5 reasons, explanations, what I hear people telling me, here they are. The first one that few people probably really don't understand, or if they do understand it, they take it for granted. It's going to be one we'll talk about here a little bit later in the slide deck, is that the Linux distribution, when one gets the ISO, in electronic form and media form, when one gets the ISO, you get a wealth of tools. It's not just an operating system and a couple shells. You get a web server, a file and print server, an email server. You get Perl, Python, PHP, C, C++, lots of libraries. It's a very rich environment that one gets with a Linux distribution. It's there, it's bundled, it's integrated, it's tested together, it moves together as a bundle, as a group. That is the value of what Linux distributions do, is they go out to this world of open source communities, they sort through the tens of thousands of packages that are out there and say, here is our Linux distribution. And as you'll see, you get 7,000 to 10,000 worth of packages in this distribution. So first and foremost, it's an integrated and highly refined, expansive set of tools and environments. It's not just a base operating system. The second thing, and something that I'm sure most IBMI customers will appreciate, is that Linux skills and resources are abundant. This is what people are learning in college. This is what my 17-year-old son does in his free time. This is what he wants to study as he goes off to university, is he is working in Linux. That means when you need a new employee in your enterprise or when you need somebody to go work on an application environment, you can literally go hire skills that have this knowledge. And so that's the second reason that Linux is important, is the abundance of Linux skills and resources. The third one is actually the most, probably the newest item that I hear these days, is really the innovation that's going on around Linux. People who want to adopt new software technologies that are coming to market will have to do it with Linux, because that is where the innovation is occurring. That's where KVM, the kernel virtualization management, the new open source virtualization, that's where it was developed, was in Linux. It is the single most supported, best supported operating system and operating system environment in OpenStack, tied very tightly to KVM. In fact, I've heard statistics that 70% of the OpenStack deploys occur with KVM, not VMware, which should surprise many people. And it's where all of the new applications that are being developed today are being created. You're probably familiar with the IBM Watson systems and our heritage playing Jeopardy, and now we're solving medical problems and helping people learn how to cook and all sorts of new and wonderful environments. Well, at the heart of Watson was Hadoop. You probably saw in the last October announce the IBM data engine for NoSQL databases. That's Redis. This is where, as I've said, innovation is occurring in the next generation of software that is on Linux. The fourth reason people go, Linux has now demonstrated enough reliability, security, scalability, etc. to be part of their enterprise, a rather basic but not to be forgotten fundamental. It's there. And the fifth one is that because it's open source, it's extensible, it's self-supportable. In fact, you can even go out for most of your Linux problems, do a Google search, find out somebody else has had similar problems, and figure out how to help yourself, as opposed to calling into the 1-800 number where you're put on hold, you run through a script, you feel like the person really isn't trying to help you. You can support yourself in a Linux environment, whether it's your enterprise, whether it's you personally. The open source nature of Linux means that the definition of support and the processes by which things have been supported can be changed and enhanced. So, 5 main reasons why companies are adopting Linux today. I really love this slide. I've seen other versions over time of what's in a Linux distribution, but I got to hand it to O'Reilly and give them a shout out as well, because they're an outstanding company for documenting technical things, many of them around Linux, etc. This poster that they created, the anatomy of Linux, and the URL is below, is a great way to depict what we've been discussing. How many pieces, how many environments, what sorts of areas are addressed by Linux. So at the heart there is, of course, the kernel, right down inside the little sort of sloping funnel is at the kernel. But there is so much more about this. There are things for users to take advantage of the system. Of course, that would include whatever applications they're using. There is, of course, an equally expansive environment for programmers, all the languages we've mentioned, shells, environments, Perl, Python, Tcl, all sorts of environments, tools there for programmers. Of course, one can't ignore what webmasters want to do along the bottom, Apache, Tomcat, all the tools around doing web serving, and then all the system administration tools around the outside, whether we're talking about file systems, whether we're talking about security tools, management tools. That's what's in a Linux distribution. So many things. If I were to put it in more of a list fashion, this slide begins to articulate some of them. And the reality is the answer of what's in your particular distribution is it depends, and you'll need to check the details as the final bullet says down there. But if we work our way through it, databases, common databases you hear about, MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres, these are all databases that are freely available in the Linux distribution. You get web servers like Apache and Tomcat, and Apache by itself has lots of extensions and modules and tools and plugins that go into the Apache environment. So even by saying Apache, we're still grossly simplifying what's contained in that part of the web server. Plenty of security tools, whether it's OpenCrypto, eCryptFS, OpenSSL, AppArmor, PAM, whatever one needs for security, plenty of packages there. Of course, the programming environments, and I've so far neglected C and C++. Sort of where I began learning to program was in C and C++. But the world continues to evolve with new things like JavaScript, as well as the languages we've already talked about. We have virtualization included in that distribution. I've already mentioned KVM for the kernel virtualization management. Most distributions these days provide that virtualization capability in their base operating system, but there's also the lighter weight version of virtualization known as containers, where you can create I'll use OS 400 speak or IBM iOS speak, sort of a subsystem type environment where I can isolate my application from other portions of the operating system, from other applications, isolate it to a set of well-defined resources, give it its own namespace, protect it security-wise from other things, and that's lightweight virtualization, is what we call containers in Linux. We have all sorts of emerging packages, some of them not even yet in the distribution. Best example of that is Docker, Docker and Go. Docker is really the killer app and the middleware environment on top of containers. Distributions are just starting to give us technology previews of their Docker solutions, starting on x86, but powers out making sure we get Docker enabled such that as this becomes product ready, Docker will be available on Power as well. Other capabilities, RabbitMQ, NGINX. We've already mentioned JavaScript, so things like Node.js and V8 come to mind, etc. Lots and lots of packages are included, and in these emerging sets are on the verge of coming into the core part of the distribution. If you want to know specifically what's in your version, here in this last section on the slides, you can see URLs to where Red Hat documents their package list, or manifest as they call it, for RHEL 7. The last list that was published for SUSE was SLUS 11 SP3, and Canonical has a generic interface where you can go look for specific packages by name out of their repository and really search for it. That's a link to the package sort of inquiry engine where you can get information on the various Ubuntu releases. So that gives you some flavor of what is in the distribution. Let's do a little bit more detailed comparison, side-by-side comparison of probably the three biggest hitters here, Red Hat, SUSE, and Ubuntu Linux versions. So each of these Linux companies' enterprise versions of Linux have what's known as sort of their upstream or community distribution. So for Red Hat, that's Fedora. For SLES, or SUSE's environment, that's OpenSUSE. For Ubuntu, they work with the Debian community, make sure the base of what they need is out in the Debian community, and then the Ubuntu release is built off of that set of packages. So the general thing that goes on in these community distributions is they turn very frequently, they change packages very frequently, but the bundles or a superset of what ultimately ends up in the enterprise Linux versions occurs in these community distributions where people can pull it, they can get it freely, they can help fix bugs, and the next sorts of versions of each of these packages, the next software technology, the next innovative things are occurring in these community distributions. Now, I didn't list on this particular page what the enterprise distributions are, but of course, for Red Hat, that is RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. For SUSE, that's SLES, and for Canonical, that's their Ubuntu server release. Each of these three environments basically charge differently, and the next two rows are really about where is the cost in this environment. So Red Hat and SUSE both have a licensing-based cost. Red Hat does it per socket pair, per number of guests you're going to run on that socket pair. SUSE, when it licenses, actually this is a power statement, so you may need to fine-tune the details, but SUSE has on power basically it licensed per socket with unlimited guests. My understanding is that they have a non-virtualized environment that they license as well, that is more simplified, but is only available in an x86 world. So, if you're interested in this, don't take Jeff's words here on the pricing for as gospel. Go please look that up. But this is really reflective of what I know from Power. Canonical, when they license Ubuntu, there is no licensing fee. In fact, anybody can go out to a Canonical website, to the Ubuntu places, and pull down Ubuntu for free. But everybody, Red Hat, SUSE, and Canonical, provide paid support. So if you have a defect, if you want help, if you need something fixed, that is where support comes in. So that is the second place one may need to pay, sort of the SWAMA charge, if you're familiar with IBM nomenclature, right? So Red Hat, SUSE, and Canonical all provide enterprise-level support for their products, and just as well, IBM will support you in this Linux environment. So it's possible to buy Red Hat Linux from IBM. You'll pay the licensing fee, which IBM will pass right back to Red Hat, and then after that, should you have a problem with your RHEL release, you can call 1-800-IBM-LOVES-YOU or whatever the number is, just like you would for IBM I or for AIX. You can call that number, and IBM will support you for Linux as well there. We won't send you, if you've paid for our support, we won't send you to Red Hat. Likewise, if you have paid SUSE to support you and SUSE gets stumped, they're not going to send you back to IBM. We will work with the vendors. You will interface through whatever the paid support model is, and we will help each other. So it goes without saying that I have an excellent relationship with all of these people, and that's really what enables us to support each other and offer different paths for support. If we continue on down, the newest version of each release, people are probably well aware, but in Red Hat, it's RHEL 7. In SUSE, it's SLES 12, just came out. RHEL 7 came out about 6 months ago, 5-6 months ago. Ubuntu 14.10 was the last Ubuntu release. Unlike the previous ones that are generally numbered sequentially, RHEL 6, RHEL 7, SLES 11, SLES 12, Ubuntu's release model is the first two numbers or digits are always the year, so that was 2014. And the .10 is the month. Ubuntu tends to be on a general cadence of an update cycle of, as 2 lines down shows, every 6 months. So there was a 1404 and a 1410. There will be a 1504 and a 1510, continuing on. So those are the newest versions. The major release versions, RHEL updates, the RHEL 6 to RHEL 7, 7 to 8, somewhere in 2 to 3 years. It's not clockwork, it's not guaranteed, but if you look historically, it's 2 to 3 years, maybe extending to 4 in some instances. SUSE is 3 to 4, sometimes extending a little longer than that. And Ubuntu, as I've already said, they do a long-term support release every 2 years that they support for a longer period of time. Then each vendor has a different update or service pack cycle. They, of course, all provide web updates for critical sorts of things or online updates that can go into the repositories that you can pull. But their normal maintenance cycle, CUME packages might be the way to think about it, is that Red Hat usually tries to give you one every 6 to 9 months. SUSE tries to provide one 12 to 18 months, so longer period. And Ubuntu, like clockwork, every 6 months. How many packages are we dealing with here? Well, Red Hat is roughly on the order, or RHEL is on the order of 12,000 packages. Now, the number that you actually get with the RHEL ISO is a little bit smaller than that. There are some extensions they call EPEL that bring it up to about 12,000. SUSE is 22,000. And Ubuntu is 52,000 packages that one gets in an Ubuntu release. So you see big differences. The installer packages are different in all of these environments. Red Hat uses Anaconda. SUSE uses YAST, which is sort of their command line tool. Zypper is their GUI tool. Ubuntu uses Ubiquity. The packaging environments, Red Hat and SUSE share something called RPMs, perhaps you've heard of. Those stand for Red Hat Package Modules. It's a technique for putting together the binaries and everything and the dependencies. It's called an RPM. Ubuntu shares their packaging module with the Debian community. It's known as a Debian package. So that's the packages are a fundamental difference between the traditional enterprise distros of RHEL and SLES and Canonical's Ubuntu product. So that's different. Package management tools differ. Red Hat uses, of course, RPM and Yum repository. SUSE uses YAST. Debian uses apt. If you're in their GUI world, you can use Synaptic, but apt is really at the base. And then if you start digging in another layer, what's the default file system? Well, for Red Hat, it's XFS. For SUSE, it's ButterFS. For Ubuntu, it's ext4. So you start to see, while there's all of these common packages that get distributed, get bundled up, the flavor of how they get put together, what the default configurations are, how does it get to you, all differ. And so, this is something one must consider in picking a distribution. Something one could consider. Oftentimes what I find is this becomes a rather religious discussion or really one-up preferences. Oh, I like YAST better than Anaconda, or I prefer RPMs over Debians. And so you'll oftentimes get those sorts of capabilities. It's probably worth mentioning a lot of the information on this page came from Wikipedia, of course, the source of all good information. And so that link is available there. Should you want to go see more information, understand more, feel free to follow that link and learn more. Let's talk about the community relationships real quickly. There, of course, in each of these communities, like a kernel community, there is a mainline community. From a Linux distribution perspective, all of those mainline communities get bundled into the community distros, as I've described already, Debian, Fedora, OpenSUSE. From there, then, code gets bundled up into the enterprise distributions. You see the relationships between each of the stacks. SLES pulls from OpenSUSE, RHEL pulls from Fedora, Ubuntu tends to pull from Debian. But then what happens after that is really interesting. So the Ubuntu community gets and actually promotes a set of derivations. They're very open about that. You can get the K Ubuntu for the KDE desktop. You can get the Edu Ubuntu, which is focused on sort of solving problems for students in education sorts of environments, or even very, very specific distributions like Ubuntu Kylin targeted for the China market. Red Hat, on the other hand, not nearly as open to having derivatives, but they do exist. Most people are familiar with CentOS. For a while, and there likely are still some remnants of, but it sort of died out. There was a set of distributions in China and other Asia-Pacific markets called Asianux, Miracle Linux, etc. Oracle Linux, of course, is based upon RHEL, if you didn't understand that, as is Amazon Linux. So if you go out to EC2 and get a cloud image, the Amazon Linux is actually a Red Hat distribution. To my knowledge, and it could just be that I'm missing it, I don't know of any SLES derivatives, but they could exist out there. But it is an interesting thing to know where all of these pieces fit. So let's go through a little bit of an exercise just to give you a feel for, in the Red Hat world, how patches flow, how communities go together, lest you be, very, very technical here. So, of course, the mainline community is always writing source. It's continuing on. They're having versions updated all the time. That's what you see sort of depicted with the gray line across time. If we were to look at that sort of in recent history, on or around January 2013, mainline communities were all pulled in, and the Fedora community basically delivered what is called Fedora 19 on or around mid-year of 2013. So they bundled up all of the things, just as we've described, out of these communities, called it Fedora 19, made it available to their folks. Now, reality was they did development in advance of that, but Fedora existed, or Fedora 19 was officially released mid-year 2013. A little bit later, about 6 months later, they started work on their next version that became Fedora 20, that released right about the beginning of this year, late 2013. Again, same sort of process. Bundle up what's out in the community at all the new levels, call it Fedora 20, send it out. How does that relate to Fedora or to Red Hat based upon the previous slides? Well, RHEL 6 was already in existence. There was nothing that Fedora 19 could do relative to RHEL 6 at the time. So no impact on Fedora 19, or no impact on RHEL 6, but RHEL 7 could actually use a Fedora release, Fedora 19, more or less as a base. It's not identical, and if you talk to the Red Hat folks or even the SUSE folks, they won't tell you just because something's in OpenSUSE or Fedora, it makes it into SLES or RHEL. But reality is they start with a code base somewhere, and they don't usually go back to mainline here. They base it on something that's already been tested. So in this example, Fedora 19 base really helped feed the RHEL 7 base. Cool, makes sense. What happens next then is that the CentOS community sees the RHEL 7 source and they start building CentOS 7. So it is derived from RHEL 7. And when RHEL 7.1 comes out, the first update, some 6 to 9 months, some point here in the future after the base, there will be a CentOS 7.1. So this is how things tie together. Now, let's get a little creative and a little technical. What happens if Jeff wants to fix something mid-2014, or better yet, add a new feature, support for a new platform? Well, Jeff would start in the mainline community. That's represented by the star back up at the top. You see that would keep us out of most of the things already on our paper because we would have missed all the arrows that flow through this. If Jeff does nothing with his code, it ends up basically in the Fedora 21 release. The next time Fedora pulls something, it would end up in that release. So, okay, that makes sense, but how does Jeff get it somewhere else? What if that code, Jeff wants that code in RHEL 7? Well, it turns out I can actually, because it's open source, I can go out, I can take the code that I've changed, I can go make an equivalent set of code changes on the RHEL 7 base, and suggest that to Red Hat as a part of the development process. So I can actually build a patch and send it to Red Hat as a part of the development process. Well, this is not something the typical developer does. This is something we do in the enablement, platform enablement side of the business, but this is the value add that all of us platform vendors provide as we go out and work with folks like Red Hat, SUSE, and Canonical to get these patches in. Now, if I put that patch there, it will, of course, flow into CentOS 7.1, but it is still possible to put it in 7.0. There will be some updates to 7.0, so I could once again put another patch against CentOS 7 and send that patch there too. It is worth noting, however, that that patch becomes obsolete when CentOS 7.1 or RHEL 7.1 comes out if I have not sent it to RHEL 7, which explains why we took the time to give the patch to RHEL 7. So this is how the ecosystem gets enabled. This is what Jeff and his team do, is this sort of Gorpy detail. It is not anything that you have to worry about as customers, unless, of course, you're going to consume very, very early community versions, or you're going to be part of this process, you're going to contribute to development. But if you're a normal consumer of Linux, you simply allow your enterprise vendors to hide this complexity from you, allow them to bundle all the pieces, but it is worth understanding how these things flow in case you're looking for a specific feature, a specific platform, etc. Platform enablement sometimes becomes something that frustrates people from time to time, and if you understand how this process works, it's very helpful. If not, let the vendors hide that from you. Okay? So let me just give you a foreshadowing of some more of the things we're going to talk about in the next section on why Linux on Power, and just show you that IBM has strong support across Power systems for each of these three vendors and their distributions. Won't go into the details here, but the key real point is, even for Power, even when you get a Power ISO or a Power DVD for, say, SLES as an example, that ISO is built from the same bits, built using the same tools, compilers, delivers the same libraries, the same levels. This is where the commonality begins, and it's delivered on the same schedule as the x86 ISO. So it's not like SLES 12 for Power appears 3, 6, 12 months after SLES 12 gets released into the marketplace. It's not like it has different versions of things. SLES 12 is SLES 12. Ubuntu 14.10 is Ubuntu 14.10. Libraries are the same, kernels are the same. Same in the sense of at the same level, built from the same source. Of course, the Power ISO has Power binaries, and the x86 ISO has Intel binaries. But it really is the same versions, levels, and it's that commonality that becomes key to our value proposition we're going to look at here in about 3 to 4 more slides as we wrap up that value proposition thought. Let's start to look at what's going on in the marketplace as we start to now probe and think about why people are adopting this. If one looks at historic operating system adoption, going back 5 years, a rolling 5-year average as reported by IDC. Now, IDC, the last report we had came from 2012. They're just getting ready to release their 2013 number. I don't expect it to change really the trends at all. What one sees if we look at the raw new subscriptions, both free and paid, of Windows, Linux, Unix, and everything else, we see that the raw new subscriptions for Windows has sort of been fluctuating, but it's roughly flat. We see that Linux has been growing from 2008 to where it is in 2012, and that growth is largely what is driving the total overall operating system growth. Furthermore, if we look at percentages, and I realize that the percentages are missing in the 2008 column. If we look at that column for Windows, the number is 63% for Windows in 2008, just under 30% for Linux, and just over 6% for Unix. If we jump ahead to 2012, while the total volumes for Windows has largely stayed the same, its share of the pie has decreased to 58%, while Linux's growth is now up to 40%. So we've gone from 30% to 40%. We've grown by 30% over those 5 years, and Unix is now down to just over 1.5% from being 6% of the total pie. So it is down both in volume and in percentages. So Windows is clearly sort of a steady environment. Unix is declining, and Linux is clearly growing in volume and percentage of the marketplace. Now let's dive into the Linux numbers a little bit more. When one starts to look at which Linux vendor, one way to think about it is who has the most market share. So if we go back, slightly different IDC report, but we look at the Linux volumes, free and paid, both sets, over that same time frame of 2008 to 2012, we see that the overall Linux set of volumes has grown over that period. We see that Red Hat has grown. SUSE looks like it's grown a little bit. And Ubuntu has grown, noticeably as well. Let's look then at, the percentages. So in 2008, Red Hat was just under 50% at 47, almost 48%. SUSE was 24.5%, and Ubuntu was 4.5%. If we jump ahead to 2012, Red Hat not only has grown in volume, but they have taken market share. They are now up basically 10% over the previous number to 52, almost 53%. SUSE, while they've grown by volume slightly, is actually down in their overall market share, down to just over 20%. So they've come down about under 20% from where they were as far as market share, from 24.5 down to 20%. And SUSE has grown from 4.5% of the market to now 7.5% of the market. So they've not quite doubled, but had significant growth in what they've been taking on in the marketplace. So an interesting set of breakouts of distributions. Now, am I recommending you buy the most frequent distribution or the largest volume of the distribution? No, I'm just saying these are the trends, something to consider. And something to look at and certainly be aware of when looking at this. What do I recommend? And I oftentimes get the question, how do you pick a Linux distribution? Now, as I've already said, most people have already decided which distribution they're going to pick. I don't get this question very often, but I have thought about how do I recommend which distribution to buy. So the first thing you should always consider when picking a Linux distribution is, does that distribution support the application set you want to run in your enterprise? That's the first question. That's the most fundamental question, but sometimes we forget about that. So sometimes applications will run on Red Hat, not on SUSE. Sometimes they'll run on Red Hat and SUSE and not Ubuntu. Sometimes they'll run in a Debian environment, thus Ubuntu, and not Red Hat or SUSE. It just depends. Always be aware of what operating system is supported by your applications. Second thing to consider is, in your market, amongst your competitive businesses that you compete or you're always interacting with, which Linux distribution are they picking? Said a little bit differently, for other people that do things just like you do, what decisions have they made? It's a good way to think about that, and there might be a reason a particular distribution is common in your industry. So maybe it's a file system that's supported. Maybe it's an application that's supported. So if you don't know, look at what your peers in your market are doing and figure out which distribution. Now, this This might be, in the bar at night when you guys are swapping war stories sort of discussion, but think about what your competition is using if you haven't selected a Linux. Third thing, think about your geography. If one looks at the worldwide distributions of Linux and then looks at the geographic distributions of Linux, you will find trends like Red Hat is the dominant Linux vendor in the United States. However, in Europe, SUSE tends to be king. Makes sense. Their headquarters are in each of those countries respectively, or each of those areas respectively. So, things like geography may play a role here in your considerations. And the final thing I always encourage people to think about in their distributions, or when picking your distributions, is who's going to be your peer support group? Who's going to be your user group? And do they have a preference? So if there's a Linux users group in my community, in my city that I'm running my headquarters in, or that my data center might be located in, what does that support group tend to talk about the most? That's a great way to pick a Linux distribution because, like I said, this is an extensible environment. It's easy to support yourself. This self-help group, this peer support group, is going to be a key part of how you get Linux service as you adopt Linux's environment. So that would be the final consideration of selecting a Linux distribution. So before we wrap up here, I want to take you through the thought process of what I see happening in the marketplace. We've talked a lot about it's open source, it's common. There are, lots of things in common, but there are some subtle differences. We've talked about how one might adopt Linux or make a decision of which Linux vendor. But before we wrap up here, I want to take you through the thoughts of why are people doing this? What are their thought processes? What is the role? Why does this all make sense? And so it begins with the idea that we're striving for commonality. And to truly understand this, you have to take a little bit of a geeky look at this, or a technical look at this, and use something like the software stack as the basis for this discussion. Here's what I see happening. So if you have this software stack on the right-hand side here of the page, applications are at the top. Yeah, we could split applications into apps and middleware. Largely irrelevant. Just think of the end-user consumable pieces there as the application. We certainly have operating systems underneath that, so applications run on operating systems. We're all familiar with Windows, Linux, AIX, iOS. Those operating systems may or may not sit on hypervisors. It's a key part of my thinking here, so I'm going to include hypervisors as a separate level. And then, of course, we have the hardware architecture underneath. Now, beginning about the recession time frame, this stack was really, really scrutinized inside of the industry. And my thinking about that was that a key part of how people thought about this really comes down to the visibility of each of these layers within their enterprise. If I were to walk in and say, I want to change your application environment, you would probably be more likely to scream, no, you can't take DB2 away from me because there's higher visibility to DB2 in your enterprise. Or maybe Domino would be a great example. Versus if I changed your hardware architecture but left the rest of the stack the same. Fewer people probably actually touch or can tell the difference between platforms at the bottom of this stack than they can at the top of the stack. And so visibility means as I change various components, by changing them, I interject a difference. A change is cost. And so as we've tried to drive cost out of the enterprise, we have really strived, worked for, maybe a better word, set the goal for commonality. And this push for commonality, if we look at the industry, has really come from two directions. And it hasn't been symmetrical. From the bottom up, we tried for as much hardware commonality as possible. Remember the good old days where we had token ring and Ethernet and things finally converged to Ethernet? Or how about SSA and fiber channel? Fiber channel 1, standards like PCI emerge as opposed to the old SPD architectures if you're a really OS 400 historian. It's now PCI. So we really have converged on the hardware architecture pieces with a lot of common parts, but processors remain as the fundamental engineering decision that likely will never converge. How does an Intel processor compare to a power processor? Well, they strive for different things in life, right? It's an engineering set of trade-offs. So convergence and commonality only went so far and only can intellectually, technically go so far at the bottom half of this software stack. However, on the top half, we can and have seen huge advances in commonality. So let's work through along the bottom what's happened in this evolution of the software stack moving down. When I joined IBM 20 plus years ago, 25 closer to years ago, the platform one ran was really the software application. In fact, I love to tell this story. You know, at home, the best software editor that one could use was something called AmiPro. This was in the WYSIWYG days where what you see is what you get. If I wanted to do software editing at home or desktop publishing, I used AmiPro. When I came to work, my 3270 terminal did not have AmiPro on it. We had to use something called Bookmaster that we affectionately called Bookmonster. Roughly the days of Profs, I believe, and I don't remember the OS 400 extension of that. Maybe it was Doc or DocBook, something like that. But at that point, each of the platforms had their own application for a given function. That didn't last too long. Things like Java came to the marketplace. Everybody remembers Java and knows Java, the write once, test many sort of revolutionary language. And application providers, like our good friends at SAP, got smart, like our friends inside us IBM Software Group, and said, listen, I can write WebSphere for cross-platforms, or I can provide the SRP Business Suite for multiple platforms. And so we got smart about how we were architecting applications and realized we could provide one application like WebSphere across multiple, again here, air quotes, platforms. What that meant was operating systems and the hardware underneath them. Well, you can guess where this is headed. With the advent of Linux and what we've been studying here, Linux has converged the next layer. Applications are written to Linux. If I want to pick RHEL 6.3 as my operating system, I can get a set of applications that have been written to the libraries, compiled with if they use the open source tools, the compilers associated with those Linux versions. Providing binaries is a very simple output of that, but I can write for Linux and I can make apps that will be written to be cross-platform and provide them, and it simplifies the support, the development, the test of those applications, and now it's an application running on Linux. And what is platform then? Platform, it turns out, then is really about hypervisors and hardware architectures. Now you know why I wanted hypervisors in here. KVM is sort of the final piece in this evolution of software stack. It is going to be for hypervisors what Linux is for operating systems. It's going to be the single common point whereby people can adopt the platform that they want to exploit for their workload or their application environment. That means they have to train their enterprise on the application, on the Linux operating system version that they picked, and KVM, and once they do that, it's a simple matter of picking the platform. So at the end of this, what you really have done is you've leveraged open source, which all of these layers generally are, at least the KVM and the Linux layers, and a lot of the emerging applications that we're seeing are open source. And you've driven commonality now into the enterprise, which means you have made the platform selection, platform again with air quotes, or the hardware architecture selection, as cheap as possible in the enterprise. And so this is what's going on in the marketplace. This convergence is saving enterprises money. Most enterprises have multiple platforms. Every time you have a different hardware platform, a different hardware architecture, you've historically had a different operating system and a different environment above that. People are saying, no, Linux simplifies that for us. And now with KVM, KVM will simplify the next piece of that. So they're converging to that commonality across their enterprises. And because the enterprises are doing that, the next generation of applications are being written for that environment so they can take advantage of whatever platform does best for that environment. So it is really all about money, but it's money because it's expense that's saved by commonality, and most people can take advantage of this in their enterprise and leverage this. And so this is the fundamental thought, this is the fundamental rationale of why people are adopting Linux. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up here. Remember those three objectives at the beginning? Here's the summary. See if we covered all of those in our session today. So we introduced Linux. We said it's had a long history. Linus Torvalds brought it to market in 1991 when he gave us the kernel to complement what the rest of the open source communities were doing at that point. And we've come a long ways from that simple kernel toolchain environment to a very robust set of open source technologies that are driving cloud, that are driving new middleware, and giving us the next generation of software technology. So hopefully I've given you some indications, some thoughts. I've mentioned things that you've heard about, tied that all together, whether it's Docker, whether it's KVM. That's all Linux-based software technology coming to the market. Second thing I tried to do was really help you understand the various Linux distributions. I talked about the differences in what packages come to market in that, some of the flavors, Debians versus RPMs, how many packages, how often do they update, how are they licensed. There are differences. Some of them, to be quite honest, are taste differences. Kind of like picking the difference between a Mercedes and a BMW. If I like Mercedes, that doesn't mean BMW is a bad car, or vice versa. Right? I would argue that in some sense, each of the Linux distributions are all great vehicles to buy, to use the car analogy. So don't be afraid to pick one, but do pick with care, knowing that there are differences, and not all Linuxes are equivalent. So once you get into a Linux vendor, then they certainly have a consistent theme and a consistent set of behaviors that you can train your enterprise, your people, your employees, your customers and partners on. So that's the second key thing is the differences. And the third key idea, which was really sort of the premise, what are people doing with Linux? Why are enterprises adopting Linux? Is it comes down to cost. In fact, you'll oftentimes hear oh yeah, I like Linux because Linux is free. Well, you'll hear the Linux people say, yeah, but it's not free as in free beer, and he'll use the quotes there. It's really free in that the source code is freely available, and it's because of that fundamental aspect of open source and what the Linux environment is doing. It's changing how enterprises support themselves. It's changing how they support their platforms. It's taking cost out of what's going on in the data center, and it's driving the next generation of software technologies as we've talked about. So that's really why people are selecting Linux. That's the value to the enterprise. So hopefully here in our little over an hour, you've appreciated this journey. We've been doing Q&A in the left-hand side of the panel. If you missed that because I failed to mention it at the beginning, please feel free to put in your questions. I'll be answering them, time permitting here, taking a look at them. But do ask your questions. Do feel free to reach out per the email address on the front, the forums in DeveloperWorks, maybe on Google+. And don't forget about, we're going to take on the second portion of this topic. Okay, so Jeff, you convinced me Linux is important. Now, why would I do Linux on Power? We have that session coming up. Please feel free to participate in that and join us for that session. And it is my hope that you learned something today. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, ask, and we'll do our best to help you with this. Good luck.